Okay then, right, anxiety performance. So, Fazey and Hardy, the key research, inverted U hypothesis, a catastrophe for sports psychology, they say. That's humour, because it's got a double meaning. It changed a lot of what we were talking about in the background. They were criticising the drive theory, and they were criticising the simplicity of the inverted U hypothesis as well. So let's have a look. So we've got Lou Hardy and Della Fazey at Bangor University, which is where I studied. I must say I don't recognise either of them. But let's continue on. Okay, so get me a pointer. Right, theories on which the study is based. So it is based on the inverted U, Yerkes and Dodson, as we discussed in the background. Also based on Oxendine's extension to the inverted U in terms of the individual differences and the type of sport and the type of task, as we mentioned as well. And according to Fazey and Hardy, the inverted U model lacks predictive validity in practical situations. Predictive validity should be you should be able to guess what people are going to do. You should be able to predict what's going to happen to sports people using those theories, but they're saying that there isn't much evidence that you can do that. So practical situations, the theories don't apply too well. So they propose an alternative ending to the story of the inverted U relationship. How exciting. So this is their alternative ending. So this is essentially what the study is going to suggest. They're going to suggest that the level of cognitive anxiety actually determines whether the effect from physiological arousal is smooth and small or large and catastrophic. The smooth and small might be your usual bell curve of performance gets better as arousal increases, and then too much arousal, it just fades off. So if you have low levels of cognitive anxiety, so thoughts, anxious thoughts, then you if that's low, then you'll get the kind of normal expected bell-shaped. But if you have extremely high levels of cognitive anxiety, then as arousal improves, you're doing okay, but then suddenly, bang, when your negative thoughts, your anxiety, gets too great, you see this huge drop-off point. Arousal gets to a certain point, and you become so aroused that you cannot escape those negative cognitive thoughts that you're thinking, and it starts to really hinder you. So again, the example that I'd give is you're asked to do a presentation in class, and your performance improves. There's only a few of your friends in class. Your arousal level is, the higher it goes, the better your performance. But then someone in the class is really anxious about it, and they start to dip off. But the reason why it's nice and smooth is because the cognitive anxiety isn't that great when there's only a few of you in the class. If we take that same example and throw you into the hall in front of the principal, then if someone in your class is really cool-headed, then their level of arousal might be higher than it usually is, and their performance, therefore, is quite good. And they might, if they can stay at this level of arousal, then their performance, they might do an amazing presentation, it stays nice and stable. But for someone in the class who either didn't care at all about the situation, so didn't put any effort into the presentation, their performance is going to be low because they weren't at all aroused by the situation. They weren't scared by the fact the principal was going to be watching. But if you add in the cognitive anxiety, someone who is extremely aroused by it and really nervous and also beats themselves up about it, so they say, I'm rubbish at getting up in front of people, I just can't do it, I'm pathetic me, I just can't do it. If you mix that toxic mix of too much arousal, the principal's in the room, they can't do it, they're telling themselves they can't do it, and the cognitive anxiety is high, you see a large catastrophic crumble in front of the principal. Their performance and their presentation, they just freeze and they can't get any words out. When they recover from it, they stand there and they come back to it, They don't reach that same performance they were at when they collapse. They have to build back up to it. And that's essentially what the study is presenting. That's essentially the idea behind it, along with a review of other research. So that's where we're going with this. Low cognitive anxiety, there we go, normal kind of bell curve of physiological arousal against performance. Moderate cognitive anxiety, you get this drop-off. But high cognitive anxiety, you get this really bad drop-off. Okay, so, and there you go. Have a read of those and highlight them. It's exactly what I've just described. Pause me and come back. So, the aim of the research was to identify limitations with the inverted U hypothesis, making the distinction between somatic and cognitive anxiety, and to propose an alternate model by explaining the relationship between anxiety and performance. So they're saying your bodily anxiety and your cognitive anxiety, we need to study those separately to understand this U hypothesis. And once you start studying those separately, then you start getting those weird drop-off points to do with cognitive anxiety. So the paper examines difficulties under the following headings. So the difficulties with the basic ideas of the researchers who've proposed the inverted U hypothesis, difficulties with finding evidence for it in research. This is a review article, partly. And difficulties with applications. So again, the predictive validity, you can't predict that an athlete isn't going to perform it particularly poorly. There's not enough evidence there that real-life athletes struggle. The study consists of three issues. The study considers these three issues and then proposes two catastrophe models of motor performance under anxiety, which attempt to describe the relationship, the relative contributions between performance the relative contributions to performance of cognitive anxiety on the day and physical arousal, the task difficulty and self-confidence. So, trying to separate out the cognitive anxiety on the day. What are they telling themselves on the day? What happens on the day? Yeah, do they get a text message off someone who says, you know, you're rubbish, by the way, just before they get up there, or you're going to fail at this, or don't mess it up, or you're live on BBC Two? Like, is that cognitive anxiety something that impacts them? The authors also consider whether Siemens' model of stress and catastrophe, which we'll look at in a sec, could be applied to failure in sporting performance. So, Siemens' model, what did Siemens say? This is a really kind of weird example, but it's something that Siemens put forward. The analogy of a relationship between stress and performance. Right? Imagine this is a rubber band attached with a fixed end, and as you turn this disc, it pulls these rubber bands. Yeah. And it doesn't just smoothly keep going round. Once it gets to a certain point, it swings back round and swings forward. So you have tension, 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 and then it swings. Now, Siemens saying perhaps that is, as stress increases, so does performance until a point is reached where performance collapses and it breaks. This is quite different to the smooth performance curve in the inverted U hypothesis. And that's where their starting point was and how they ended up with suggesting this. It's like increases, increase, increase, and then crash. So that's Siemens' model that they are then saying, can that apply to sport performance? So what was the research method? It's a theoretical paper rather than an empirical study. So it's called a monograph, so a specialist work of writing on a single subject or an aspect of a subject, usually by a single author, which, it wasn't in this case, but which identifies and considers three different areas of difficulty associated with the inverted U hypothesis. So they're reviewing those problems with the inverted U hypothesis. Results, they identified from existing literature concerning the inverted U, they identified these problems. The difficulties with the basic ideas. So, most importantly, many psychologists were using the term arousal, stress, and anxiety interchangeably and not distinguishing between the three. In fact, whilst the inverted U hypothesis described the relationship between performance and arousal, It did not adequately explain the more important relationship between anxiety and performance. Okay, so if we're thinking about those athletes that crumble or can't take the penalty kick, anxiety is going to probably be just as important as arousal, if not more. So difficulties with the evidence. There's still little convincing sound experimental evidence for the inverted U as a model of the relationship between stress and performance. Very difficult to measure, but also just very little evidence. Might be theorised, there might be theories on the inverted U, but not a lot of experimental evidence that they could find. So difficulty in applying the model. Inverted U model predicts that as stress exceeds the optimal, performance will decline slightly. But that's simply reducing stress lightly will bring back the optimal performance. So Andy Murray's getting stressed, right? And arguably Andy Murray, his performance starts to go down. And so what he should be able to do is just be a bit less stressed again, and his performance will go back up again. Right? But what they're saying, the authors conclude that this isn't the case. So it doesn't look like that. It looks like Andy Murray gets stressed, and then loses a whole set. And that catastrophe model seems to fit. So difficulty with applying the model to real-life examples, difficulty with evidence in experiments, and difficulty with the basic ideas because they use these three terms without specifically talking about the different types. So they therefore proposed the model that I talked about at the start. As stress increased, so too did the performance until a critical point was reached, where suddenly dramatically fell to a lower level. In addition, their model proposed that once a performer was on the lower curve, it required a considerable reduction in stress for him or her to be able to jump back up to the upper performance. So if we follow it up, your arousal goes up, and performance increases, and at point A, cognitive anxiety is high, right? So they are thinking, they're on it and they're stressed. Somatic anxiety is low, so they are not feeling, their body isn't feeling the massive amount of anxiety, the anxiety responses. Performance is therefore enhanced. But where you get both of them corresponding, and so your body suddenly is reacting in anxious ways as well, then your performance absolutely crumbles. You can no longer hold the racket. You can no longer kick your foot. You can no longer, so your body isn't responding the same way because both your somatic anxiety is high and your cognitive anxiety is high. And then point D, performance does not return. So as soon as they calm themselves down, it doesn't go bang up to A, it goes back to much further back here, and it takes a lot more effort, by which time you've probably lost the match. Okay, so point C, performance is still deteriorating. If you don't manage to get yourself together, you just gradually keep getting worse and worse and worse. It's probably best to pretend you've got an injury and go home.